Hello, this is Dr. Laura Davis, and this is a short video lecture on Antoine Saint-Exupéry's The Little Prince, about chapters 21 until, or 20 till the end, but I will actually start a little bit before chapter 20 here. So in chapter 16, the little prince arrives on planet Earth. So that's kind of where I left off on my last video, is that the little prince had visited all of these other planets, and on these other planets we get kind of a warning in a sense of who not to be like, of aspects of our society which are not necessarily to be admired, or which are empty in the sense that there is no real meaning underneath them. So now he gets to planet Earth, and of course it starts out with quite an explanation about how much larger planet Earth is than all of these little tiny planets, often with only one person on them. So on planet Earth, he meets a variety of individuals, and this is one of those children's stories, as you know by now, where animals and plants are personified. So we have the rose, who is on the prince's own planet, who is in a sense a lover kind of figure. Some people have said that the rose is a personification of the author's wife, that the author was thinking about his own romantic relationship when he created the rose. So she's feminized, she's personified, but she is the prince's rose. And when we get to Earth, we have not just people, but also animals, such as the fox that the prince meets. And what's different about who he meets on Earth is that primarily the individuals that he meets on Earth are sort of guide figures. So rather than kind of warnings in terms of who not to be like, these figures are kind of like guides. And I think in a way we have the prince as a guide for the pilot, the narrator, right? Because the narrator, the pilot, learns from the prince as we do, as the readers, and the child reader who the book is intended for learns from the prince as well. We learn lessons from the prince. He is a guide figure for us. But at the same time, the prince has guide figures as well, such as the fox, which I'll get into in a minute. So the first individual that the prince meets on planet Earth is the snake. A very kind of symbolic animal to meet at the beginning. So the snake comes in, and they become friends, and he comes in kind of as soon as he arrives at Earth. He meets the snake, and there's no one else around, right? Just the snake. And at the end of the book, he comes back to the snake. And the snake is the one that in fact provides the poison to the prince so that the prince can die and transform into a spirit. So the snake might be likened to the snake in the Garden of Eden. There's a lot of biblical imagery, especially in the latter parts of the book, so I will get into that in a minute. The snake definitely could be seen as an aspect of that biblical imagery, but the snake differs quite a bit from the one in the Garden of Eden, because the snake here doesn't seem to be an evil figure, although the snake does provide the prince the poison. That poison is welcomed by the prince for his transformation from an earthly being to a spirit being, from a body to a spirit. So that's kind of welcomed by him rather than is seen as kind of an evil thing. And they are friends. They become friends at the beginning. So as I said, I think, the snake reminds me of perhaps there's kind of an allusion there to the snake in the Garden of Eden, but there are some key differences as well. Around chapter 20, the prince discovers a garden of roses. And it's an interesting moment for the prince because he's absolutely devastated and dismayed when he sees this garden of roses, which is odd, right? Because it's a beautiful garden. We're usually in awe of beautiful gardens of roses, and these ones speak to him and say they are roses and so on. And yet, what happens here is the prince suddenly realizes that his own rose, back on his own planet, is not the only one. That she's not unique, that she is simply one of many roses. And that's why he is devastated, by realizing that she's not as sort of special and unique as he thought that she was. So he cries. He's sad about this, about the fact that his rose is just one of many and that she's not unique and special. So this realization is, in a sense, one that I think we all come to in life, right? This kind of realization that we are one of many, that we are people like one of millions of people in the world, that our loved ones are not necessarily special, but one of many, that we are all the same in a sense. And this kind of is a very humbling realization, and it's a realization that someone like the vain man, who we meet earlier in the text, never learns, right? So this is definitely kind of a moment in the prince's journey where he's learning something. He's coming to this knowledge and awareness, and it's a devastating one because he realizes that his rose is one of many. Now this leads really nicely. So he meets the roses, the garden of roses, and then he goes and he meets the fox. And the fox, in a sense, helps him with this devastation that he's had. So when he meets the fox asks the little prince to tame him. And there is some emphasis on the word tame and what it means, just as earlier we had some emphasis on the word ephemeral and what it means. Now this to me is kind of an interesting word. I'm not sure what the original, because this book was originally written in French and it's been translated into hundreds of different languages because it has been such an important work of children's literature all over the world. And we're reading it, of course, in the English translation. But the word tame is used, and I'm not sure if it's a direct, what word is used in the French, and if it's a direct translation or if there's a little bit of a different meaning. To me, it seemed like, in a sense, not quite the right word, that perhaps the fox meant something more like love me or befriend me, right? And then what the fox basically teaches the prince is, if you befriend me, if we have ties to one another, if we have a friendship or a love relationship between one another, then suddenly I'm not like all the other foxes in the world. I'm a special fox to you. I'm different from all of them in the world. And so the prince does tame him, and they do become friends, and they do have that bond and that tie. And what the prince realizes through that encounter is that he also has this special relationship with the rose, that it doesn't matter that there are a million other roses in the world, or however many there are, because his rose is special. And this again comes back to the overall theme or trope that we've been seeing again and again in the text, which is that there is something essential that is invisible to the eye, that is underneath. There is something constant, there is something spiritual, there is something true, there is something meaningful, but we can't see it. We have to feel it with the heart. It is underlying. And this, in a sense, is what he learns when he sees the roses and then gets taught by the fox that it's okay if you have one rose of many. It's okay if I'm one fox of many, because there's something inside that you can't see that is different from all of the others. And it's something like a soul or a spirit, something like that. So that movement from the roses to the fox is a really kind of nice progression, and the prince is devastated after he finds the garden of roses, but kind of restored after he meets the fox and learns his lesson there. Okay, so in chapter 24, we get the pilot coming back into the story. So remember in my last video I said that the pilot's kind of dropped off for much of the middle part of the book when we get the prince's adventure, which is on the one hand a physical journey to these different places, but also a kind of mental and spiritual journey, because he learns different things at each place he goes. And so he's had that, and now the pilot comes back into the story around chapter 24. And again, so we get the first person, the pilot's in the story, the pilot's narrating and talking about the prince and so on. So the pilot mentions that it's the 8th day since his crash landing in the desert. And so it's been a week. So 8 days. Now, we might think here of the fact that God created the world in 6 days and on the 7th day rested, and now we are on the 8th day. So we are kind of coming toward the end if we're thinking of sort of this biblical timeline, if you will. As well, there are 7 planets that the prince has visited. So the number is interesting here too. In fact, the 7th planet is the planet Earth. when the pilot comes back into the story around chapter 24, the pilot and the prince, of course, they're in the desert. They've been there for 8 days, and now they desperately need water. They're looking for a well. They are out of water. And so they journey to the well, and there's a scene where the prince is so weak and he needs this water so much that the pilot actually carries him, and they do find the well. And that, I think, is a biblical scene. There are different instances in the Bible where Jesus carries others to safety or to salvation. We will also have a similar scene that we will come across in the book Holes, which we will study later in the course. And again, I think in Holes as well, there's kind of a reference back to the Bible in that scene. So it's a journey to water, there's a sense of carrying, and a restoration when we get to the water or the well. When they find the water in the well, they both drink from it, and they are restored. So this is kind of a key climactic part in the text, and I think there are biblical connotations here. For instance, when they drink the water, we could see that as communion, right? Drinking the body and blood of Christ, drinking the blood of Christ, drinking the water, the holy water that is in the well. We can see it that way. The other way we could see it is almost like a baptism, coming to the water, almost like a baptismal moment, right? A kind of being born anew, coming to this restorative place, drinking the water, drinking the blood of Christ, and being born anew. So there are some kind of gestures towards transformation, gestures towards biblical allusions, and a kind of climactic moment in the text here. And if you look at this scene on page 71, it's particularly telling that this drinking of the water is a Christian and a spiritual moment. So if you don't buy into this now, you will, I think, after you hear this paragraph. So this is what the pilot says. I raised the bucket to his lips. He's getting the prince to drink here. He drank, eyes closed. It was as sweet as a feast. That water was more than merely a drink. It was born of our walk beneath the stars, of the song of the pulley, of the effort of my arms, because he carried him, right? It did the heart good, like a present. When I was a little boy, the Christmas tree lights, the music of midnight mass, the tenderness of people's smiles made up, in the same way, the whole radiance of the Christmas present I received. Okay, so that's just, you can look more at that scene, but that even that one paragraph does shows that this drinking of the water is a Christian and a spiritual experience. The references to Christmas and so on, right? Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the rose. The rose that the prince loves on his own planet. And I just want to say something briefly about this, right? Because we haven't talked too much about the rose. She comes into it very early on, and she's depicted as vain. He wants to protect her. He puts the glass over her and so on. But thinking that this is kind of metaphorically perhaps a love relationship, right? That he's trying to think about his relationship to his lover in a sense. As it, as if the author is maybe thinking of his relationship to his lover. From a feminist perspective, I think that's a little bit problematic. She's clearly a woman, the rose. She's personified as a woman. And he is the adventurer who goes off to all these planets and discovers and journeys. And as I said, it's both a physical journey and a mental and spiritual journey, and comes back to her. She, on the other hand, is very much rooted in place and doesn't move and doesn't change, isn't a kind of a dynamic character. So, I mean, this is definitely more about the prince than the rose. He's the protagonist of the story, and he's trying to, think about his relationship to the world and to others and to his rose. But yeah, from a feminist perspective, definitely it kind of shows the woman figure as static and rooted in a particular place, whereas you get the male adventurer, both the pilot and the prince, as ones who can roam out and have that mobility and can return as well. Okay, finally I want to talk a little bit about the ending. After they drink from the well and they have that spiritual kind of experience and restoration, the little prince dies, and he he knows he's gonna die. It's his time to die. He solicits the snake to give him the snake's poison so that he will die. But he's very clear when he talks to the pilot about this. And the pilot doesn't see all the interactions with him and the snake. He knows something going on, but doesn't really have too much to do with it. When he does figure out what's going on, the prince is very clear to say, it will look like I'm dying, but this is a transformation. And so again, and he talks about his body as a shell. So again, we see that kind of notion of the exterior, what we can see with the eyes, the appearance, and kind of the reality of what's meaningful and spiritual and true and constant and permanent underneath, which is something more spiritual. So we get the sense that the prince makes very clear that it will look like he's dying, but he is just transforming from body to spirit. So, you know, the prince is very much a Christ-like figure, which isn't to say he plays the role of Christ himself, but he is a Christ-like figure who kind of sacrifices himself, transforms, and is reborn. Really interesting story with a lot of biblical allusions, a lot of metaphor and symbolism, and of course, in typical children's literature fashion, lots of lessons for both the protagonist to learn and the pilot, the narrator, and the child reader, as well as the adult reader. Thank you very much for listening.